Speaker.
I call Simon O'Connor.
Yawn. What a speech we just heard then from the Labor Party. What a speech. We hear yelling and screaming in order to try and replace good, reasonable argument. In fact, we're not sure what we're saying. We're just going to yell it louder. Conspiracy theories around revolts and so forth, and yet one just had to look at the Labor Party caucus on Budget Day as their leader gave, or their current leader gave a speech. Their heads hung in shame and with much concern, I'm sure, embarrassment, I'm sure. Very reflective, one would say, of their own party. We also hear now from the previous speaker more metaphors being given. We heard a whole lot from the leader of the Labor Party when he gave his budget speak, having a crack at some of our communities, talking about Seven Veils, floundering around, flapping his arms, and now we've got analogies to do with North Korea and South Korea and wars. I think for me it's just a sign of a Labor Party out of touch, but also a Labor Party, Mr. Speaker, that's out of touch with its history. And very early on in the debates today, we've been challenged on this side of the House by the Honourable Annette King and the Labor Party about, understanding our history. And this was in particular relation to the whole benefit cuts and so forth of the 90s that National went through, and trying to rail against what we're doing now. The first time, Mr. Speaker, in 42 years that real benefit rates have risen, and that's under a National government. And we were getting lectured from the other side that we didn't understand our history. So a quick little bit of history for the Labor Party, of course, is the likes of Annette King and others were in a government years before us railing against the cuts that happened in the 90s, yet they didn't do one thing to change it. These were people that in their time in government did no thing to change it. In fact, the likes of Annette King was in government before National came into government in the 90s, did absolutely nothing. Mr. Speaker, I encourage the Labor Party to look at its own history, its own inept history, its action of doing absolutely nothing and then having the audacity to come into this House and challenge us. Mr. Speaker, what was delivered last week by Bill English was a great budget. It has gone down very well in Tamaki. In fact, a lot of the changes and debates currently going on before the House are well accepted in Tamaki, that very strong blue seat. And I'm very pleased that the members and constituents are behind what we are doing. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget, I would argue, ultimately about caring. It's about caring for people at the beginning of life, through their life and at the end of life. And I want to touch on two elements of care, and the first is around the health budget. Obviously as a Member of Parliament in the first instance, but also as the Chair of the Health Committee. The health budget has now reached a record high of $15.9 billion. I think it's one example of the level of care that this government shows to continue to increase the health budget. Elements within it is like $12.4 million to extend the bowel cancer screening project. I think very, very important. We've seen some really good signs there. $98 million has been announced to increase elective surgery. We have a very proud record in this government of increasing the level of elective surgery. And now the tens of thousands more surgeries being done, and many in this House will know from their own experience, but certainly Kiwis in general, these surgeries make an enormous difference. But what I'm particularly pleased about is an extra $76.1 million to be invested over 4 years in the area of hospice and palliative care. A big part of that spend is actually to assist hospices to reach out into the community to provide palliative care at the end of life. And I think that's fundamentally important. More often than not, people will think about hospices or end of life and think about it as people in little bedrooms hooked up to machines being pumped full of drugs, and that is not the case in most circumstances. The work of hospice and palliative care is often in-home, providing pharmacological treatments and the counselling support, the love and the generosity which is required. And I think it's just absolutely tremendous that this government is putting even more money into that space. And it would be remiss of me, Mr. Speaker, not to acknowledge the wonderful volunteers and workers at the Eastern Bays Hospice in my electorate, particularly those who work in the Dove Shop, raising funds again to support their fellow Kiwis in need of pain relief, particularly at the end of life. And I'm particularly pleased about this spend because I personally I think caring for the most vulnerable in our society is critically important. We're a government that cares for those who are suffering, who are unwell, who are frightened and scared, and it's a big part of why I support this government. For many who will know my background, I have spent a considerable amount of my life working in the community and voluntary sector, caring for people. And I proudly stand on this side of the House as a National Party member and support the decisions this government makes around care. And when I talk about care, I'm talking about genuine, heartfelt care, care that talks about compassion in the truest sense, compassion that talks about suffering with people, not to go into a Latin derivation, but compassion means to suffer with, to be with them. And that's my understanding of care. And I want to just touch briefly, Mr. Speaker, on the question of euthanasia, because it keeps cropping up in these spaces. People will talk about euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide as caring and compassionate, and I want to go on the record very clearly to say that is fundamentally incorrect. I'd like to make some points for the record here in the House today. And I don't do this just as a Member of Parliament or someone of a particular religious persuasion, but someone who has spent also a lot of time in his life, if I can speak in the third person, studying these serious philosophical questions. I do it too because constituents often lament, and you hear in the media, who is going to talk about this issue? Well, again, I want to go on the record very clearly to say that I unambiguously oppose euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in this country. It is not genuine care, and it is not genuine compassion. Mr. Speaker, there is no such thing as a right to die. There is a right to life, and for those of us who have worked with people to the end of their days, understand the fight that is in there to preserve life. There is no such thing, and I say it as a rights theorist, as a right to die. Mr. Speaker, there is an illusion when people talk about choice in these areas. The fundamental thing with something like euthanasia, and this is the opposite to what we're talking about around good palliative care, the thing about it is that the choice has been given to others. We are all free agents to exercise how we want and our choices, but something like euthanasia is giving the choice to others to make them for us. And again, I think this is a fundamental problem we need to consider. And I also just want to add, and finishing on this little part, because it is a heavy topic, but it's one that often is shied away from in talking about the heavy issues. I want to say to those in our vulnerable sectors, particularly those with disabilities, that I, and I'm sure many in this House, stand beside you when you watch and hear these discussions with concern. I want to say to you very clearly in those communities that I believe in genuine care and genuine compassion and the need for us to stand beside you. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of a government which has put more and more money into palliative care to provide that assistance. I'm also very pleased around the welfare reforms. I read some opinionator and stuff who says to those on the centre-right, they are people who generally despise the poor. I thought that was just a shocking statement. In fact, I would challenge that writer who says that basically we on the centre-right generally despise the poor. I challenge her to write down all the stuff that she's ever done to support people, and I'll do the same. And I'd be pretty sure whose list is going to be longer. I am very proud to stand in this House, and to actually not arrogant, to back a real record of experience. Doesn't mean that I'm any different from any other New Zealander, Mr. Speaker, but I back the work that I have done, supporting people in the hospitals and in the hospices, on the drug scene, people in the homeless shelters, the counselling that is required, the people up on K Road struggling with issues of their prostitution or their sexuality, genuinely working with these people. And Mr. Speaker, it doesn't mean that I stand here and have all the answers by any means, but I derive from them some experience which informs the way that I think. And really important what the left misses is that we then marry that up with training and academics which says, why do I feel what I do and how can I express them in the words that can be understood? And that is one of the fundamental differences between this side of the House and the other side of the House. So this side of the House has genuine experience, genuine learning, brings them together and attempts to help New Zealanders as best we can. And we've seen it with a marvellous budget, bringing in extra money to help the most vulnerable in our our society, and amongst those, families with children. Again, I said at the start, the first time since 1972 where benefits have actually increased. Not a Labor government, but a national government. I'm very proud to be part of a government that genuinely cares.
I call Clayton Mitchell.
Speaker, rise on behalf of